we'll make a shot at having a bit of a stop and a chat here, and we're looking out across the true alpine areas of Kosciuszko. I think it's just a couple of 100 square kilometres. Actually, it's completely treeless above the tree line. The area where it's too cold for too much of the year for trees to grow here. And also, if you see the permanent water that in the landscapes we drove through across there, the permanent feed on offer all year round, or not all year round, but all through the summer periods, reliable food, reliable water. You can understand why through Western eyes, newly arrived European eyes, this landscape looked like meadows to them. And if you could get your animals up here, you had a significant economic advantage in being able to fatten them, get them to market during times of drought, relieve pressure on the lowland farms from which they were being brought, and generally have access to a very useful resource for sheep and cattle. And animals, as you heard from other informants, were brought from considerable distances, not merely from the immediate landscapes, both to the off the Monero and up from Victoria, but progressively from further and further away, driven in to take advantage of what in Australia can be quite unreliable, which is moisture, water, and good quality food. So we'll talk here a little bit about the geology of this area briefly and its ecological characteristics and its value to the cattlemen, and then we'll go on up and have a discussion up at the lookout. And we make some apologies, but not all that much. It's not our fault. It's Gilly Gambras and his relatives bringing in the wind here. That is a feature of this country, but it will mean that the audio you're hearing does have wind in the background. We'll try and speak loudly, but there's a limit to what we can do. Speak loudly.
Okay, speaking loudly. As Robert mentioned, this is the true alpine above 1,850 metres, generally on the mainland. It gets lower, the tree line gets lower into Tasmania, where it's down to about, I think, 1,500 metres in Tasmania, mostly due to latitude. On a geological timescale, these are ancient mountains. That's what makes them so special. They've had a long time of stability geologically to develop a really amazing soil profile. So up here, about 350 million years ago, there was an island chain basically along the east coast of Australia. It went through a period of uplift, another long period of quiescence to about 65 million years ago, when New Zealand decided to break off and become its own little gang over there. For 65 million years, we've had geological stability up here on the main range, and over that time, like I said, a long time to develop and a very deep soil profile, which is quite unlike most mountain regions around the world, where you think of the Himalayas or even New Zealand itself, which is still uplifting. Very steep mountains, there's not a lot of soil profile, especially up high, whereas we have soil right up on the ridges. There's sort of three main types of soil: the lithosols, which are right up on the ridge tops itself, which are mainly just pebbles with a little bit of soil inside. And then we have the alpine humus soils, which are quite friable, really high in organic matter. It all breaks down really slowly up here in these cold environments, of course. The alpine humus soils cover most of the sheltered slopes and valley sides, and then down in the depressions we find the peat soils, so quite anoxic and very waterlogged. We have peat bogs measured back to 10,000 years, taking cause 10,000-year-old peat bogs have found up here in the Alpine. So we have a very amazing soil profile, which leads to our incredible flora diversity up here. So 212 species found up here in the Alpine itself, so above the tree line. And of those 212 species, 21 of them are endemic. They're only found here. That's as Robert mentioned, the cattlemen saw this as a great opportunity to come up and fatten their cows up. Permanent water storage. We can see here behind me on this side is the headwaters of the mighty Snowy River that we saw dammed and constricted down there. So on the left, looker's left, is the Snowy River, and then Clock Lake Creek flows in from that side, and it all joins into the Snowy and flows down to Guthaga, etc. down that way. Sorry, what was my next? Soil, stability, flora.
Maybe some of the soil conservation work which is done up here to
Yep, okay, so I mean, as back as early as the 1890s, Baron von Müller was up here, Ferdinand von Müller was up here looking at the alpine flora, and he saw right back in 1890 that there was quite large-scale erosion happening then. There was Robert Helm as well, another government-paid botanist who was up here looking at the alpine flora. He was also putting pressure into the government saying, hey, the erosion from the cattle and the grazing and the sheep is having a marked impact up here. Fell on deaf ears, kept falling on deaf ears until 1930 or late 1930s when Baldur Biles, who was a young and upcoming forester, came up into the alpine region, and he was looking out over the alpine ash forests, and what he could see was the alpine ash forest lower down on the slopes were getting choked by the amount of sediment flowing down the hill being lost due to the grazing up here in the alpine. So unlike Ferdinand von Müller and Helm, he actually found a really strong political ally with Snowy Hydro, so political and economic ally, I should say. So Snowy Hydro then looked upstream of their dams and said, actually, if we don't stop the erosion up here, these will infill within the next decade or two. And so that was the push that the alpine needed, and the cattle were then evicted out of the leaseholds were finished, and the cattle weren't allowed to come back in by late, I think, 1937. It was up above in the alpine, the cattle weren't allowed to come up here anymore. And so Snowy Hydro, without Snowy Hydro, how long would have cattle grazing continued? Unknown. Luckily it did happen, and for the first 10 years after they evicted or got rid of the cattle, they decided to just let the alpine area go and see how it rehabilitated by itself. Nothing happened. There was no rehabilitation on its own back because of very short growing seasons, very harsh climate, and so much soil had already been eroded off the alpine. In fact, it was Alec Coston who estimated that overall across the entire alpine that 1 metre of topsoil was lost. That's huge for an alpine to even have a metre of topsoil, but then to lose it downstream was quite incredible. So 10 years passed, no revegetation happened, and that's when the CSIRO Alpine Ecology Unit teamed up, and they came up to started the Soil Conservation Society, and they put in 25 summer seasons of continual revegetation works. Now this was pretty crude back in the day. It involved, they sort of cut terraces into the landscape to slow the sheet erosion. They infilled gullies with topsoil brought in from elsewhere. Spraying of tar with seed mixed in happened on quite large areas of the valley sides up there. And if you walk up to, just beyond or to Blue Lake and beyond Blue Lake, you really see the scars still in the landscape up on Mount Twynham especially. Mount Carruthers, sorry, I should say. And so red fescue was an introduced species that was utilised heavily up in our alpine area, changing a bit of the dynamics of the ecology for sure. But they did find areas that hadn't been too trashed. There was seed stock that they could then start utilising and introducing back across the landscape. And so it took 25 years, but eventually they declared it rehabilitated enough that they could stop coming up on an annual basis. So that's wonderful news. I've actually got a little, it's probably more subalpine, just a little diagram of Alec Costin's revegetation plots. And so this first strip, might not be very good here, but this first strip was, so 1957 when they removed the cattle from lower down in the subalpine. So the clear is bare soil, and then the green is the vegetation that was present. This is without doing anything to the soil or the plots. This is the same plot repeated for years, or 4 tests. The first time there was only 30% vegetation. 10 years later, there was up to nearly 50% vegetation. And then another, not quite 10 years, there was 70% vegetation. And then, another 10 years later, they declared it rehabilitated. And that was all of its own account down lower in subalpine. Up here was a very different story. No revegetation really happened until they stepped in. So,
what elevation that was exactly?
about 1,300 metres, so at Dana's Gap. This is, right at Dana's Gap.
Dana's Gap was
Yeah, it was a real thoroughfare for the cattle to come up and down from the mountain, but also Dana's, who had the leasehold, were notorious at overstocking their land, which most of the graziers. It does. It was stripped back to everything. And that, taking away the soil really decreases the capacity for the environment to recover. It has no nutrient store, it has no water store for times of drought, and the seed stock is also gone from the landscape. But success story down in the subalpine, thank goodness it did come back. It took a long time, but it did.
Do you find there's much push from pro-grazing stakeholders like the Farmers Association to move, obviously the cows haven't been here for a long time, but to move them back? Is there much of a push from the other side?
It's just a deep-seated resentment. I don't think there's any... I don't feel that the grazers have any hope that they could bring the cattle back into the alpine zone. So, they, up until recently, they were still grazing Victorian alpine areas. But, sorry? Oh, no. But I don't think in New South Wales there's any push. There's just a blanket resentment towards us.
I would suggest that the idea that there's any real belief that you can get cattle back here is probably not on their minds. But I think one of the ways that resentment lingers is in many people's attitudes to brumbies. The brumbies are strongly associated with the cattle families. They're their animals. Typically, they've got away, potentially released, but got away. And I think part of the empathy for the wild brumby running around up here without controls from Parks and Wildlife and without controls from voters in Sydney and stuff, I think echoes with a resentment that as we were removed and our cattle were removed, we're going to hold the line against the brumbies being removed. So it does speak to, rightly or wrongly, that feeling that you had a value up here, you lived a lifestyle up here, 200 years, you were the iconic great Australian outdoorsy type who could ride around on a horse and shoot animals 100 yards or whatever, and live up here in the rough, and that you were doing good for your country because this land is pretty damn worthless, and you were getting an economic revenue out of it, and you were feeding and clothing people, and how on earth was that a bad thing? It wasn't an easy lifestyle. You wouldn't bring up animals here for the fun of it. And so to be disrespected, to be removed, to lose economic income, these all linger. Whether they could have done a better job at negotiating or justifying or compensating, who knows? But definitely local political support for certain flamboyant political local party members will get resonance if they run on these sorts of issues about let's stick it to the Parks and Wildlife Service, let's stick it to the conservationists, let's stick it to the voters in Sydney and Melbourne who don't have to live the realities of a rural lifestyle up here.
Having said that, rural lifestyle, there was a 3-bedroom hut just down here. It was very extravagant for the time. You can still see the chimney standing basically straight down in a line from us. So, you know, there's... They did. They certainly did. But it was a rough lifestyle. You know, 200,000 sheep and up to 20,000 cattle roaming this very fragile landscape was just unsustainable.
We may get to stop at Japan. We may stop at Danes Bog briefly on our way out and see some of the damage that the animals did to the areas they concentrated, which were the sphagnum bogs, because that's where lots of the moisture was. And in breaking down those walls of those bogs, and sometimes the cattle would do it on purpose so the animals didn't get themselves bogged, you then oxidise those soils out, and that will never come back. You heard that they're essentially glacial, and the conditions for their formation haven't existed for how many thousand years. You could put things like wads of hay bales in to stop the water move through them, but you couldn't really bring them back once they'd shed out. So that severely changed the water holding capacity, and a lot of the hollows that we've seen by the roadside, many of those will be bogs that would have held water once that have lost that out and shed. So the cattle, the actual activity of the cattle, and then finally where fire was used to get that green pig coming back into this landscape, so that when you brought your animals up in the new season there was feed on offer. That was, if you like, how many levels of insult we've just worked to. That was the third or whatever we've got up to. That burning removed that tight relationship between the plants, the roots, holding the soil in situ. I mean, this is almost a metre here. That's about a metre high. This bottom of this bench here. That's a lot of soil.
That is a lot of soil. And you know, without you remove the vegetation, you take away that net holding the soil together, and the soils are really prone to erosion as soon as you take away any of the vegetation. Whether it's in a bog or just on the valley side, it just erodes. I mean, with this, like, there's sort of broad 6 plant communities up here in the alpine area, and of those 6, 3 of them are critically endangered ecological communities. So it's really, you know, we've got very rare, unique plant communities all trying to exist up here, and then add in 2-ton cow and 200,000 sheep, and it's not a lot of hope left.
We spoke about regenerative agriculture yesterday, and obviously the cattle are never going to be brought back here, but at the time they were here, do you think that the effects would have been lessened if they had done that kind of motion of moving around a bit more and a bit more controlled with the regen that they do now?
Possibly.
It would have been hard because the leases were small.
Yeah, I don't think they had a lot of space to kind of, and there were so many up here that there wouldn't have been the space to sort of, where they roamed free wherever they went kind of anyway, but then within their leasehold they just, and the gentleman who owned this leasehold with the hut, he was also notorious at overstocking, so Warren might have said 500 cows, he might have had 1,000 cows anyway, so even if you had restrictions in place, they didn't necessarily adhere to those.
And for the first 100 odd years or so, there were no restrictions.
No,
There's just
right.
a sort of frontier mentality where the odd bit of fisticuffs, if not the occasional rifles, sorted out who had access to what leases, and they ran around trying to brand each other's, calves to claim they were each other's and that sort of stuff. So pretty Western frontier, as an American Wild Western sort of frontier type lifestyle going on.
It's also a very different environment. Like the environments where regenerative agriculture works are environments that were typically grazed. This is not an environment that was typically grazed by anything else.
And the regenerative period, I mean, like you only got 3 months or whatever of any regeneration going on in any one year, so think Charlie Massey had it bad down at 750 metres or where he's at. You're 300-400 odd metres higher up, so it would be hard. But I think it's okay. We talk about negotiating and discussing and compromise-free outcomes. I just don't think that there's an ecological reason why there's not a compromise balance between letting animals in and not letting them in. In Victoria, they did some exclusion trials on plains, and it's unambiguous. There's not a happy. Let's do half a cow wandering around here, or it doesn't work. You have to have a whole cow, and it's just not.
Yes, the whole cow will take the whole plant as well.
Yeah.
So.
We probably should move on shortly to discuss, but it is worth touching again, and I don't want to sound too biased, but the idea that grazing stops blazing, this sort of stuff that you're looking at behind you is the sort of stuff that burns it and grasses. So the cows don't eat this in the first place. So they're not going to graze that back. That's highly flammable. But one of the main things that's going to burn is your sub 6 mil fraction grassy regrowth. And unless you're going to burn that off every 6 months or so, it's going to be back by the following season anyhow. So much of the hazard reduction burns that do go on in these areas are mostly economic asset protection.
Yeah, there's no back burning that happens, hazard reduction burning that happens up in the alpine itself.
Yeah.
But down lower in the lower alpine, we're actually hesitant to even use hazard reduction burning now down in the subalpine because it's actually not very successful.
Yeah.
It encourages a lot more growth than if you just selectively trimmed it out. So yes.
And you can only do a hazard reduction burn in conditions where it wouldn't create a hazard bigger than the thing you're trying to reduce. And when you have long dry spells, there's not a window where setting fire to the landscape would make any kind of sense at all. And again, I just want to distinguish, and Sam might make the point again, indigenous fire management practices in lower landscapes to keep it healthy. That's a different story. That's the condition under which people did that, completely different from just setting fire to this sort of landscape because you want to get an economic asset ready to go when animals come back. That was not what was motivating people down low country saying, I think this land, I can't throw my spear through it. I think it needs to be tightened up. Yeah. One of our guys wrote his essay, if you can't throw a spear through it, the land's no good. And those were his uncle's thing was, if you can't chuck a spear through it, you let it go. It needs to be helped.
Anyone who's been walking around here knows you can do that. Like it's nice and it's beautiful bushwalking because you can just kind of walk through it. It's really open. It's really nice.
Down in the country, that's different. Any other questions from the back there?
I have one about the Brumbies. So obviously, yes, feral horses. That's good to know. That's your stance. So you said about how the cows take a full plant, for example. Can you just compare the differences between the impacts of the horses and cattle? Is it very similar? And also about where are the feral horses here? Because I think a lot of people look and go, well, I've never seen one being up here. There can't be that many, but we know there's such large numbers. So can you just kind of give us a brief overview of that?
So cows use their tongue to wrap around a plant and will kind of yank it out, whereas horses eat more like this, and they will eat quite low to the roots and sort of eat really low. As the plant gets lower, they just eat lower. Same as the sheep. The sheep will eat right down to the roots, killing the plant off. So sheep and horses are kind of worse for the environment even than cows, because cows don't always pull it out. They often just get the grassy sheath and will just pull the grassy leaves out, whereas sheep and horses will eat right down low. In terms of where are horses in the park, if you ever drive to Tumut, you will always see horses, particularly now that it's been really burnt out through that Kyandra landscape. Huge numbers of horses. Every time I drove up there for the last couple of months, you'd see a mob of at least 50, quite close to the roadside. The stallions leave huge mounds of to mark their territories, and so that's always an obvious sign through the landscape up there. Having said that, I have seen a horse at Rawson's Pass, and there was 2 horses at Rawson's just making their way over, and then went down over the Threadbow Valley. So, and the really sad outcome of that was that Threadbow had it all over their social media. Come and see our Brumbies. We have Brumbies now. It was whoa. The alpine area itself is actually an exclusion zone. We are allowed to cull horses in these extremely sensitive environments, but down lower it's a very different story. And now that there's actually been national heritage listing for the feral horse, I'm not sure if that exclusion zone still flies, so we'd probably want to check that out. Hard hooves, heavy animals, trampling, they are amazing weed vectors. They will transport hogweed particularly, but all the other kinds of weed, wherever they roam, gets caught in their furry fetlocks or in their tails, and as they walk through the park they just distribute, and also in their dung. And they can also, the critid fungus, which is affecting our frogs in the national park, is also quite linked to horse transport and vector through the park, just getting caught in their hooves again and on their fetlocks. They will transport critid fungus, so pathogens, as well as potentially phytophthora, which is like a waterborne mould that we find in the soil. And we've had quite a big dieback event associated with phytophthora back in 2012, I think it was 2011-12. We had really warm summertime temperatures with really high rainfall, almost double the annual summer rainfall up here in the Alpine, and so that sort of mobilised a lot of phytophthora through our soil, so that can be linked also to horses.
Like they did this whole campaign about come and see our wild horses, and that. How do you think we can change that perception of the Brumby and the majestic horse to that it is the feral horses?
You often are preaching to the converted. If someone agrees with you that horses should be removed, then they just have that underlying assumption that the environment can't deal with the horse, whereas if you bring it up at the LJ on a Saturday night, you might get punched out by someone who's really emotionally attached to that legacy of the cattlemen and the horses. The horses went to war. Didn't go to war. So there's a lot of emotion involved, and it's very hard to change someone's very deep-seated belief. And you know, we're talking like my neighbours are Pendergasts. They're the original farming family to settle in Jindabyne. Though my neighbours are not particularly vehemently opposed to getting rid of the horses, but there are certainly a lot of very long farming connection families in the area who it's just passed down around the dinner table at night. It's just part of the family. We support horses. So how you change someone's mind about that, we haven't succeeded yet. If you have any ideas, let me know.
So, I mean, some possibilities I think exist in talking a language that they do understand around horses suffering, starving, and otherwise being in the sort of condition that if the RSPCA found like that on your property, you'd be up for a maltreatment case, and they really do need to be shot, for example, which is to appeal to the sorts of care that they have, that the horses are in somehow good condition or enjoying themselves. Their hooves are growing out and their teeth are lost and they're starving, then you put the thing down just humanely anyway. So, you know, not easy, and it's one of the topics that we do address through the course. How are you going to engage with rednecks who like driving around in four-wheel drives, trashing sand dunes? I mean, can you talk a language that they understand? Because if you want to go down the path of just demonising them as the wrong-thinking other, it's going to be hard to get them embracing whatever solution you're trying to put in place. But it ain't easy.
I mean, even in terms of like where the feral horses came from originally were generally they were either escapees or they had been let loose from the farmers who had come up into the alpine and subalpine areas for the summertime fodder. They didn't want to share it with all the stock or all the extra horses, so they would shoe the horses and let them go, and those horses then would breed, and then they actually were a big problem for the grazers up here in the summertime. And so they would have their traditional Brumby runs. We've all seen the Man from Snow River, I hope. You know, the Brumby runs were romanticised. They were, you become a man. It was very much a part of their culture to treat the horses like this sport. RSPCA did an investigation into Brumby runs, and they found it was the least humane way to capture and euthanize horses. So they, in terms of how they feel so emotionally connected to the horses, they were killing them in horrendous ways, scaring them, panic, fear, all of those things were involved in Brumby runs. And I don't see all of the pro-Brumby people putting their hand up to take one. They're welcome to. They can come and collect them from the stock pens. That's fine. You can take 10 if you like, but there's not enough farmers to take all the horses.
Talking maybe 16,000 animals. There are not 16,000 horse lovers who are going to gist 16,000 untrained wild
And generally
horses.
unrideable.
Unrideable. You can't jump on
They're
the
small, they're ungainly, they're not this beautiful romantic silver Brumby image when you see them in real life. So I urge you, go for a drive to Tumut one day.
Like it's like on Long Plain. Like if you camp there, you will hear Brumbies at 3 a.m. every night. They come into the camp. Like I had a mate that got like rolled by one, like broke his leg. Like he's lying in his swag and he got wallowed on. You know, like there's always Brumbies there. It's nuts. It's really
They
crazy.
actually closed the whole Blue Water Hole campground for quite a while to try and make it safer, to try and catch some of those horses and remove them from the park because they were causing so many issues.
And you don't want to hit one in your car.
No, you will die. People have died driving along that Kayunja Road after hitting a horse. So, yes, it's not wonderful.
Maybe one last question here, but otherwise we'll start to get a bit cold and maybe want to meander around a bit further.
Is there much in the way, I don't know the right word for it, but like they do it for like a lot of other feral animal populations, like the kangaroos, like the desexing of them, so they just can't continue breeding, or is that just too hard to do?
It's very hard to do. I mean, there's always talks about sterilising the horses, but you've got to catch them. You've got to still sterilise them, and then what would be the point to release them? So no, it's not cost effective or effective.